Hello, I'm Grant Hickman. I'm the Senior Product Manager for the Security Policies Group here at GitLab. I wanted to walk through some of our plans today around compliance enforcement of security policies. So I'll start by talking through why this is important, some of the problems that we're going to be focusing on, and then we can speak to some of the solutions or plans that we have in place today. So first off, why is this important? And when it comes to security policies, essentially, these are the guardrails by which organizations operate. And this allows us to surface compliance requirements or internal requirements defined by some initiative um, into policy. And these policies are often correlated with some type of business risk. So, for example, an organization may have requirements through a framework such as SOC 2 to ensure that multiple reviewers review any changes that may impact production. Another case might be that an organization has identified a number of potential risks and they're creating a security initiative that they want to define policy and enforce against all of the software development lifecycle. So this may be a policy that runs security scanners, identifies vulnerabilities before they're introduced into production, and then they can address or mitigate those risks. However, security goes beyond just encouraging the right behavior. We also have to ensure that we are compliant, that 100% of the time we're mitigating risk once these policies have been defined. And sometimes that exceeds just internal desires from a business to mitigate risk, but there can be real life, pragmatic, practical, legal implications if compliance is not properly met, and that may result in fines or other penalties. So to address these pain points, we've identified three core problems to address within this epic. The first is the use case I just mentioned briefly above, and that is a common core requirement from customers as well as some of our own internal stakeholders to be able to enforce review and approval by multiple reviewers on every merge request, which is ultimately every change that may impact production. So this ensures that there's no single user that can unilaterally introduce a vulnerability or negligently introduce something that may cause risk to the business. The second problem is really a set of different um, scenarios where users might circumvent a policy. So we want to make sure that any policies that are enabled are enforced 100% of the time. But what could happen or what could occur is that project owners or maintainers may use several mechanisms, maybe well-intentioned, but they may use these mechanisms to circumvent these requirements. So an example is renaming or unprotecting branches. So if a policy is targeting the main branch specifically, then it's possible to change the name of your default branch to circumvent that policy, and maybe the user does this temporarily, and then they change the branch name back to main once they've merged a change, maybe to address a hotfix or something that is again well intentioned. They may also, if a policy is targeting protected branches, then they may want to modify a branch to unprotected, circumvent the policy, and then change that setting back. A few other options are pushing or force pushing to protected branches. So this is a setting that could be modified at the project level, and perhaps the owner or maintainer may make this change, which allows them to force through changes and circumvent the merge request process altogether, which means there are no reviews and potential negative implications of the changes that they're making. And then the last one is another set of settings within project settings for merge request approvals. And what you can do is enable or disable the setting to allow merge request authors to make their own changes and merge them or approve their own changes. This could allow a committer, so someone who's contributing to a merge request, to commit a change and also approve that change. Um, and if a commit is made to the MR after all the necessary approvals are accepted, um, then that could circumvent the approval process, and essentially the subsequent or latter commit could introduce a vulnerability that has not been reviewed. So within this epic, we've got a number of sub-epics that we'll use to address these challenges and close the gaps from a compliance standpoint. And then the last problem I wanted to call out is really as a result of the first two, we're expanding the scope of our scan result policy type. So rather than only evaluating policies or evaluating merge requests based on the result of security scanners, we can also target any merge request and add these additional requirements and modify project settings um, in any project. So we're updating the name to merge request approval policy to uh, reflect that change in scope. Okay, so let's go into some of the individual sub-epics and speak to those changes that we're planning. Okay, what I did want to highlight real quick, we have completed two solution validations, working with users to validate the change in name to merge request approval policy, as well as validating the UX and the flows that we've defined here. So you can find more information there. And I'm also working on capturing some of the feedback that we've had from customers and stakeholders. I don't think this is comprehensive of all the customers, obviously, that are interested in this. This is a very common point of feedback that we've received. So we're working on kind of capturing and collecting those here. Okay, so going back to problem one, we want to enable or enforce two-person approvals on all merge requests. So the sub-epic that will focus on that is this epic here. So allow users to enforce MR approvals as compliance policy. So the first change that we'll be introducing is in the new merge request approval policy type. We'll introduce a new option in the configuration to target any merge request. We will have a setting so you can enforce that against any commits or just any unsigned commits. There will be an option here to also override project settings. So this will ensure that two-person approval does happen in every case. And so we can talk about each of those options. But then the last part of the flow is some existing functionality, but this is where you can define the number of approvers required, and rather than in the current scenario requiring an approval from a security reviewer when a scan result finding violation occurs. In this case, you can define two approvals required, for example, from a developer or maintainer. So two approvals with those two roles. And so that will ensure that any new merge request that's created will enforce and require this additional review or approval. Okay, and then yeah, let's speak to these settings that could, I think there's a lot of kind of technical details to cover there. So the first, we'll talk about the four different settings here. There's prevent approval by merge request author, prevent approval by anyone who has added a commit, and then if there is a commit added after approvals have been given, then we want to strip the approvals and require them again. So for these three settings, we will default to true. There's a fourth setting that we can override, and I think this one is just a bit less common, so we'll default that to false. As the user hovers over each of these options, we want to provide a little bit more context. So as you're defining these policies, we'll have a hover state that provides more detailed description. And let's see, what can happen here too is these settings can be enabled on any policy, and we'll have these defaults. But you may have one policy that's targeting one set of projects, another policy set that's targeting a completely different set of projects, depending on the requirements. So we'll have the options available in every policy. But what can happen is you may have conflicts. So maybe you have one policy that has prevent approval by merge request author, and then the second does not, and it instead has this setting enabled. So what we want to do is to default to the most secure posture or position possible. Another scenario might be that the target project actually has these settings all enabled, but the policy does not have these settings enabled. So in that case as well, default to the most secure position, and let's keep that setting enabled for the project. So if essentially if any policy or the project has a setting enabled, we will um, keep that setting enabled for the target project. And then lastly, I wanted to note here, as we roll out the changes, this could impact existing policies. So while these are defaulting to true for new policies that we create, we want to default all to false for existing policies, so that users can actually make that change and communicate and work with those project teams as needed before beginning enforcement. Okay, I think that covers everything in that section. Okay, yeah, next, so we covered problem 1. Let's talk about the various circumvention flows. So we'll note that the branch-related flows here are already in planning breakdown, already ready for development. So we've been discussing these, but I'll just highlight very quickly what we're working on there. So first off, we are introducing a new option to select default branch, protected branches, or all branches. I'm looking for the design, so here they are. So rather than today explicitly listing the branch name, such as main, users will be able to select any default branch. That means that regardless of the branch name on any of the projects that are being enforced, we will enforce the policy against the default branch. So that avoids that circumvention of renaming the branch to something different. We'll always enforce against the default branch. Same goes for protected branches. If you have more protected branches beyond default you want to enforce against, you can select that option, and you could always also select specific branches. The scenario that can happen here, though, is you may have a scenario where you're targeting or enforcing against protected branches, but maybe some developer has by accident marked their branch as protected, and it is not relevant for the enforcement of the policy. So there is a flow to be able to work between the developer and the security team that manages the policy to add their branch as an exception, and that would free up the user to be able to protect that branch and avoid the enforcement. And I think related to this effort, there are some project setting overrides that you'll see in a different epic to where we lock the ability to unprotect the branch. So I'll call that out here shortly. Yeah, and I think this one we've covered in the past, but we speak to the YAML and some of the detail required to be able to add exceptions. So we would capture the name of the exception branch, and then the full path for the project and group, or if we want to create an exception, branch exception against an entire group, you can just specify the group level. Okay, let's see if there's anything else I need to cover here. I don't believe so. Okay, moving on to the next two kind of options for circumvention here. There's force pushing and pushing. So that's covered in this epic here. So these two settings we want to be able to disable. I'll note that this is anytime that we have enabled uh, one active security policy. If there's one active security policy enabled in that project for the targeted protected branch, then we're going to disallow these settings to push or to force push. And so kind of wanted to highlight and call out this is an implicit enforcement. So there isn't a control or setting that can be enabled or disabled. So uh, the only option that we'll have here if you want to enable that setting is essentially to disable uh, the policy or to remove this project from the scope of, of the enforcement. Um, we will also want to include an error. So where this scenario would come up is more likely in the terminal when you're actually trying to do a push or a force push. So we'll want to create our own custom error response to alert users that this is not an option, that they're disallowed from pushing or force pushing. Um, and yeah, both of these features I think we'll definitely want to ensure that pushing, force pushing, that these occur at the same time, because this will be a change in the behavior of existing policies. So we'll want to create a banner message and start alerting users in advance of rolling this feature out. So that can give them time to, if they want to, disable policies or modify the scope of their policies, or alert their own teams that these settings will be disabled moving forward. They'll have time to do that or provide feedback to us. Um, all right. Yeah, so once this happens, once we've disallowed the policy, yeah, this is the design I wanted to kind of call out for force pushing or unprotecting branches. We'll also be going into the projects and changing some behaviors there. So you'll see that the allow to force push option will be grayed out. I think this needs to be updated in the design now, but this is the other setting. If you just want to push or if you want to force push, we'll gray that out. Once you've protected a branch, you'll see the protected branch list appearing elsewhere in the settings as well. And then that way you can modify from there and protect the branch. So these settings allow to force push, allow to push and merge will be grayed out and unprotect. And then we'll have a hover state to give more context to the user that these settings have been disabled by a security policy to work with the security team to manage the policy if there are any concerns. For example, if they wanted to have a branch added to an exception, so we'll have more detail and documentation to link to there. And while it's not in the design, this push to merge or push and merge state, what we'll want to do is enforce essentially that no one is selected and that it's grayed out. So this may be something we can continue to iterate on in the design itself, but we've called out that requirement here. And we talked about error messaging. So this is just kind of going in more detail about how that could appear in the terminal. Okay, yeah, if you have questions on that, please let me know. So we covered renaming branches, unprotected branches, pushing and force pushing, and the last one is in terms of circumvention would be these merge request approval rules. So I think we kind of did speak to that to some degree. Yeah, we talked about it here. So I think I would just note, yeah, these are settings that are in merge request approval settings in each project. Oops, I'll need to update that link. I'll just find it. Request. Oh, approval settings, I think. Yes, so that maps to these approval settings here. So when we are in the project settings, I think that's something that may not be clearly called out in the project settings in the design, but I think we'll need a similar lock and hover state for users to show that we've disabled these project settings. So I think that'll be a follow-up action for me from this video. Okay, and then the last problem that we called out is just the change in policy name to merge request approval policy. And so that'll be the last epic here. Yeah, and we've been documenting the various locations that we'll want to update. The text here, this is just a terminology change, but we will want to make some changes in the YAML. We'll want to make changes in our various screens, and the breaking change of using, I believe we decided on approval policy here in the YAML. We'll want um, to roll that change out in 17.0 as it's a breaking change. But that is what we'll be working on in this epic. Okay, anything else to call out? Checking my notes. Yeah, I think there's one note is that we do have we do have this epic currently assigned to group source code. So we'll be working with them to see, if this is something that they'll be able to include on their end, or if we need to take action from our end to implement it. But we'll definitely be collaborating with source code on these changes. So just keep that in mind. All right. Yeah. If there are any other detailed questions, please reach out in the relevant epic, or just reach out to me, and we'll keep working to refine and start breaking this down for development. Thanks for your time.